Hello, welcome to Kreston Reeves Governors' Responsibilities for Academies webinar. My name is Susan Robinson. I'm partner and head of Charities and Not-for-Profit and an Academy specialist. And with me is
Phil Reynolds. I'm a senior manager and specialist in Academies and Education.
The topics we're going to cover today are governance structures in a single academy trust and multi-academy trust, effective features in governance, financial oversight and monitoring, governance versus management, role of the trustee, liability of trustees, and protecting a trustee. When we see trustees, we're talking about governors.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to start exploring the certain structures you get with academy trusts. The first one is a typical one you see with a single academy trust structure, where we have the members at the top, the trustees underneath them, and then underneath the trustees there'll be usually various committees. For example, as in the slides, we've got premises, standards, and a finance and audit committee. However, that changes slightly when we move on to multi-academy trust structures. So again, we still have the members at the top, we have trustees at the bottom, and then underneath them we have local advisory bodies, or they're also known as local governing bodies, where they sit as representatives of each individual school. We're also seeing matched structures moving forward into hubs as well. So this usually happens where trusts maybe have schools in various regions around the country. So again, members are at the top, trustees underneath, and then we have two separate hubs in this case, which basically are representatives of each local governing body of each school. And occasionally you will find that there'll be committees coming off the trustees again, such as the finance committee or audit committee. In terms of the members, it's very important that people should be aware that they only have an oversight of the board of trustees. That is what their role is. They are not management and therefore should not be getting involved in day-to-day decisions. Their main responsibility is actually to appoint the auditors and receive the audited financial statements. But as you can see, they also have the powers to appoint and remove trustees, amend the articles of association, change the name of the charitable company, and if they ever reach this unfortunate circumstances, wind up the academy trust. As Susan mentioned at the start of the webinar, whenever we talk about trustees, we also are referring to governors, and we're also referring to directors. That's because in academy worlds, you very much find those terminologies intertwining with each other. Ultimately, the directors have to comply with the Companies Act 2006. Governors have to comply with DfE regulations, and trustees have to comply with the Charities Act. And these all overlap one another. They're all very familiar, very similar. It's very important that whether you're a trustee, a director, or a governor, that you do have very good communication with the members, but more importantly, those people underneath you, those committees, or even those local advisory bodies and local governing bodies. Obviously, time can be an issue, so you do need to come up with a bit of a plan of action. And of course, if this doesn't work, do feel free to change it. No one has got the right answer yet in terms of what is the perfect governance structure for multi-academy trusts. The trustees really are there to hold those local and governing bodies to account, but also it's very important that they must hold the CEO to account for the trust. That, though, can prove quite challenging, particularly when the CEO sits on the board as a fellow trustee, and that is something the National Governors Association are always looking at and challenging as to whether the CEO should really be sitting on the trust board. And in quite a lot of trusts now, we're starting to see where the CEO does not sit as a trustee. But ultimately, the big message is that governance is all about ensuring your school or schools run effectively and they follow good practice. It needs to be distinguished from management. It is not about doing, it is about ensuring things are done. Now, obviously, if you have staff governors on your board, that can prove a bit of a challenge and can be a bit of a conflict there, because they have a role of being a trustee and promoting oversight, but they also have a day job that they are employed to do, and it's very crucial that they get the balance right and they manage to segregate those duties. As I mentioned, the ESFA are trying to move away from staff governors, and some articles now are allowing you to do this. In terms of what the roles are of the local advisory bodies and local governing bodies are, that's very much dependent on what the scheme of delegation, effectively known as the SOD, is there for. It will tell those local bodies what they can and can't do within a trust, but ultimately your oversight is only at the local level only. But equally, you need to be aware of compliance. For example, Companies Act, DfE regulations, etc. If you step outside those rules and are not aware of them, you could make a decision at a local level that could really impact on the wider trust. And therefore, it's very important to still be aware of those rules, regardless of the fact that you're not a trustee. You should really be following the strategic plans set by trustees and obviously not step outside the scheme of delegation, as I mentioned. You're not really that decision makers. They are the trustees. They will drive the strategic view of the trust. You will make some decisions, but you're not going to make those day-to-day decisions. It's also very important that you maybe have a representative from your local governing body sitting up on the board of trustees so that you can help champion your school or even your local hub to the trustees and inform them how well you're doing or why you maybe need that extra bit of finance for some new computer equipment or something like that. Therefore, it's really important you are active as a local governing body member. You're not just there attending and being silent. The trustees can't do the role for you, so you do need to show willing and get involved.
On this slide, you see the effective features in governance. None of this should be unfamiliar to you. This should be quite clearly how your behaviour, your principles and your personal attributes you should be demonstrating. Is it about strategic leadership, accountability, being open and reasonable? It's people, the right skills and the commitment to the schools, having good structures in place to ensure good controls, and compliance, adherence to the regulations, both Companies Act and those issued by EFSA. And evaluate your actions and procedures. These will change over time and will need to be adapted. They need to be considered that they're fit for purpose. One of the things I would recommend is you look at the Charity Governance Code. Even though this is not actually for directly for academies, it is essential reading for all trustees. It was released in July 2017. It was an update of a previous one, but it is good reading. One of the comments that was made is that following topic. It's vital that charities get their heads around governance, following good governance practice, not just paying lip service, but really understanding and applying them, could have averted many of the bad headlines of the last 2 years. It's more than ticking boxes, it's about attitudes and cultures, whether a charity puts its values into practice. It's about how trustees make decisions and how well they understand what's going on. We have seen consequences of failing to do that. Where it says charity, put in schools, academy schools. Don't let yourself or your trust face the consequences of failing to do this. So let's go through the 7 principles of the governance code. They underpin your organisation purpose. So when we're talking about organisational purpose, you are there to educate the pupils. And I think that's key to what the school's going. Making sure you understand why you're here, what your purpose is, and what you're trying to achieve. Sounds basic, but sometimes people need to step back and think about what they're doing. Understand the environment you operate in. What are the challenges you face locally, specifically to you? The board should take a leadership role. They should be strong and effective, setting strategy and direction. They should have sufficient time to commit to the role. Have integrity, a culture of respect and good conduct, acting in the best interests of the trust and safeguarding its reputation. Decision making should be informed, rigorous and timely. Seek independent advice where appropriate. You don't know everything. Consider the risks and what you will do to mitigate them. The board should be effective, as we said previously, the right skills, experience, background and knowledge. Respect and consider the difference of opinions. Diversity enables the board to stay informed and responsive to a fast-changing environment. Finally, be transparent and accountable, building public trust, accept feedback and deal with complaints properly. Putting it into practice. Those who do it well demonstrate the following. They understand their strategic role. They ensure the board has the right skill set. They appoint effective chair to lead and manage. They evaluate their performance regularly. One of the things that's been encouraged is actually to do appraisals of trustees, but they need to know what they've got to do in the first place to be appraised, so make sure it's quite clear. Make changes to improve effectiveness. Know the trust, data, schools, senior leadership team, and then you set policies. When you reviewing the skills sets refers to the competency framework for governance. To help you evaluate your own performance, the DfE has produced 20 key questions for the governing body to ask itself.
Okay, so if we now move on to the financial oversight and monitoring, it's very likely that in most academy trusts they will have their own separate finance committee to deal with this side of things, and that is what is recommended. However, it doesn't always happen, and sometimes we do see the trust board undertaking some of the roles here. So therefore, it's very important that you do understand what your role is. Ensuring a robust control framework is in place. What does this mean? Well, this is about ensuring there is segregation of duties, which can actually be a real challenge at a primary school. Applying financial discipline, ensuring regularity, reducing risk, and that will be key in maintaining a risk register, and ensuring you have independent checking of controls and systems, and that will come from your internal audit process. You must also approve the trust financial statements, and you must approve a balanced budget. Now, by balanced budget, that doesn't just mean in year, that includes your brought forward reserves. So if you do make an in-year deficit, that isn't an issue unless that in-year deficit forces you to be in an overall deficit position. In the recent Academies Financial Handbook, you'll see that they want to ensure that finances are scrutinised properly now and salaries are challenged and reviewed. This is a real hot topic, particularly around CEO salaries. Therefore, it's important to ensure that you consider benchmarking and maybe even a third-party bit of support to help you make sure you are giving the right salary to the right people. In terms of reviewing your risk register, then make sure that does happen quite regularly. For example, do you have Brexit at the moment on your risk register? That should be a topic on your risk register. Now, it might not impact on your school heavily, but it's still a risk, and we still don't know what the outcome is really going to be. So I would expect that to be seen on there at the moment. And you should also consider business continuity and contingency plans. In terms of understanding your accounts, we can help provide training sessions on that, and we'll have more details on that at the end of this session. And also, different sources of income and how they can be used is also an important part of your financial oversight and monitoring. If we move back to governance now, as we mentioned earlier, it's all about being governors and having that strategic view and distinguishing yourself from the management. And hopefully this clarifies it, because this isn't about rubber stamping. It's not about being operational, and that can be really tough. I'm a governor myself, and so many times I have to sit on my own hands to make sure that I'm not taking on too much and trying to do people's jobs for them. Is making sure they do what is the right thing, and therefore utilising your own skills and knowledge. And therefore it's important to contrast between executive and non-executive roles, particularly executive roles, because that is effectively what the CEO does, not you as a trustee. As it says there on the slide, governance is not about doing, it's about ensuring things are done. If we explore a bit more on governance versus management, here's quite a nice comparison slide. As you can see there, as trustees, you'll make group decisions, you'll have a long-term focus, you can have a whole overview of the organisation, and your volunteers, you're not paid. Whereas if you're staff with management roles, you are paid, you can have narrower responsibilities and particular qualifications relevant to that role. Management are really there to put forward suggestions and improvements, and governors are there to challenge those suggestions and then decide whether they want them or they don't.
If we return to the role of the trustee, if you remember earlier we had the big circle on one of the sides. There were 3 core competencies expected as trustees. That is the duty of compliance, duty of prudence, and the duty of care. If all 3 can be achieved, you will have a well-run academy trust which delivers the education outcomes for the children in the trust and for the public benefit, and hopefully solvent as well. So what does each of these mean? Let's look at them in turn. Duty of compliance is making sure you do comply with company law, charity law. You don't need to understand everything. You haven't got to read the whole Company Law Act, Charity Law Act, but to have awareness of them and an understanding. There are the requirements of the Department of Education. These can change each year. Governance. Unfortunately, as more bad things appear in the press, more governance oversight is required. You should act with integrity, avoid conflicts of interest, and misuse of public funds and assets. What you also need to do is ensure that the local governing bodies are exercising this too. But you need to think, how do I do this? How can I carry out my duty of compliance? What resources do I need? And think about what you need. I think the key thing here is you don't want to be on the front page of the local or national papers unless it's something positive. One thing picked up, I think, just refer back to what Phil said earlier, trustees are not paid for their duties. This is ignoring the CEO and the staff trustees for a moment. They are paid for delivering education and management. They are not paid for being trustees. The key thing is no one must benefit from their position or their connections with the Academy Trust. However, they can receive reasonable and necessary expenses. Probably something to just be picked up in this area is the conflict of interest. And this is making sure that people are aware of what all your other relationships are to ensure that we don't hit conflicts. They will arise, but there needs to be procedures in place to manage them when they do arise. If we then move on to duty of prudence, this is about ensuring the Academy Trust is solvent. I know this is difficult in today's environment, but it's looking at future budgets, it's looking at cash flow statements. You have use of public funds, and these assets can only be used in the furtherance of the Trust objectives. What you need to do is avoid any activities that might place at risk funds, assets, or in particular reputation. Care when investing if you're in a lucky position to be able to do that. The personal conduct of trustees is important because often that can land up on the front page of the paper and that will impact on the Academy. And I say conflicts of interest. You need to understand what each other's trustees' potential conflicts could be to ensure that they are managed appropriately. The prime concern is trustees' interests. Act reasonably and prudent. But I remind you again, local governing bodies should be considering this and exercising a duty of prudence. Duty of care. Use reasonable care and skill, using personal skills and experience to obtain external professional advice. You need to review your skill set and make sure you've got the right balance. You can't know everything, but you are jointly responsible. And if you don't challenge questions, you're not acting with due care. The other thing to consider is not just looking at technical skills, look at behavioural skills. Do you have people that have a different view? If you're all very similar in your outlooks, nothing's going to change, nothing's going to be moving forward. So you need a mixture of behavioural as well as technical skills. So you're ensuring, have you got an accountant, someone with legal, marketing, educational versus people skills, someone that's inquisitive and someone that's innovative. And you probably will need different trustees at different times. For example, if you're doing some big building projects, it might be of use to have a trustee on the board that understands construction and property. I just want to talk about meetings, because one of the questions we often ask is, how often do trustees need to meet? The Academy's Financial Handbook says you need to meet at least 3 times a year. However, if you meet less than 6, then state why in the accounts that you have to only meet less than 6 and how you are confident that oversight is achieved. You don't want to have too many meetings, but you need to have sufficient meetings to enable you to carry out your role. You should make well-informed decisions. If you don't have all the information you need to inquire about it, it means going outside the organisation, then you need to. The decision and the information you have is sufficient for the affairs of the Academy Trust. Meetings should have an agenda structure. Where possible, I would advise having a clerk in place. It's very difficult, someone taking minutes that's also been part of the meeting. I would encourage trustees to forward ideas for discussion in advance. Make sure that all the documentation for the meeting is sent well enough in advance of the meeting so people can review them. And it is important you do review them before the meeting so you can ask the right questions. And if you think there's insufficient information, ask for it prior to the meeting, not in the middle of the meeting. Trustees can be personally accountable for liabilities or for making good any loss, but this is only where you've not acted prudently, you've not complied with the law or the governing document, or you've incurred liabilities greater than the value of the trust assets, knowing this to be the case. Academies can insure trustees against personal liability, but it's your responsibility to ensure that you've acted properly. You might have insurance, but that won't cover the hassle of having to fight your corner.
In terms of protecting trustees, we always recommend that trustees reduce their own risk by being familiar with the governing documents. As Susan mentioned, taking professional advice as needed. That is so crucial in today's world when rules and regulations are moving at such a pace. Ensuring you've got those effective internal financial controls is important, and having them implemented. Understanding your contractual obligations and also ensuring you've got the adequate resources to fulfil them. There's no point having these obligations if you haven't got the resources. And give induction procedures for your new trustees. Make sure they know and understand the trust. Make sure they're given the adequate training, and it's regular training. Of course, it wasn't too long ago that the House of Lords Select Committee made a recommendation about training being mandatory for charity trustees. If charity trustees are being told that they must have training, then surely educational trustees might be next. But then again, training is always needed as a proof for Ofsted anyway. So hopefully it shouldn't be too much of a challenge if that was brought in. How can you protect yourselves? Well, again, as Susan mentioned, reading certain guidance, for example, the DFE guidance, reading your Articles of Association, reviewing certain Charity Commission guidance, which is all freely available on their website. But above all, act in good faith and act with integrity. If you can do those traits, you're probably on a good starting point. And of course, staying up to date. I always recommend that trustees have at hand a copy of the Academy's Financial Handbook and a copy of the Trust articles in any meeting. It's always useful just in case that one area crops up that you haven't quite got all the knowledge of, and therefore you can refer to those documents and make sure you make the right decisions. As I always say, and excuse the pun, but every day is a school day. For new trustees, as I mentioned, make sure you do find out about the Academy Trust. You know and understand its history, its ethos, its cultures, its values, and also the schools within it. Understand what the expectations of you are Read the annual reports from the last couple of years so you get a bit more of the background and history of the trust. Meet existing trustees, meet senior staff, get to know their personalities and their little traits and what makes them tick. Obtain a copy of your governing document and read it. And above all, be committed and do take that necessary training. That pretty much concludes our webinar on governor responsibilities. We hope you found the content useful. If there are any topics you would like clarity on, then do please get in touch with our contact email details, which are on the screen. We do have further Academy training events throughout the course of 2019. If you wish to find out more about those, then please visit www.krestonreeves.com/events. Thank you.